My name is Derek Gruen. I'm a co-executive director at Front and Center, but I'm actually going to hand it over to Rosalinda Guillen, who's a co-lead for our community council that leads our work to take us through our program. So Rosalinda, if you can unmute and kick us off.
Thank you, Derek, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Really am excited that that you're joining us today. So my name is Rosalinda Guillen. I'm with Community to Community Development, and we've got a great group of speakers today. We're going to afford you the opportunity for questions and answers at the very end. So please, anytime you can start putting your questions into the chat to the moderator. We have our efficient staff monitoring and helping us with this online presentation to you. So I'm the Director of Community to Community Development, and my role within Front and Centered, we are, of course, one of the founding organizations of Front and Centered, but we focus on our organization on food systems, food justice, food production, and the impact of climate change on food in general. And this is from a farm worker perspective. So we're looking at this from worker justice in the fields and in the packing sheds. And Front and Center is our coalition that we rely on and we work with in solidarity and trust and confidence on issues relating to climate change and climate justice. We believe that as Brown, Black, and Indigenous peoples, we need our own coalition and our own focus on how we're going to address the changes that are happening in our communities. That climate justice or climate change is bringing changes that affect both our traditions, our cultures, and most of all, our economic well-being. And we need to really work with everybody, not just in different areas. So Front and Centered is really about that, about self-determination from some of the communities like farm workers in rural Washington state, and of course urban centers also, but that have been really impacted by pollution from corporations and other sources in our communities. So we are the communities that are at the front lines many times of basically survival, and we are looking to have a voice in policy making. We feel that that is the future. We have to grab it now and try to guide the direction of policy rules, the economy in Washington state into a future that will afford us survival with equity and justice for all of us. We as an organization, myself and several of the team members of Community to Community, and a lot of the folks that are on the community council with our co-lead, Yolanda, participated in the writing of the initiative 1631. And I think that that is part of our history, that is central to our theory of change, to our viewpoint of how we look at our future and self-determination. So that writing of that initiative really laid out a framework for that self-determination that involves policy and the economy of Washington state. So we know that people ask us questions all the time, right? What do you want? What do you see in the future? Why are you involved? Because sometimes the solutions that we bring to the table seem out of the box or impossible to a lot of people. And we insist that it's not, because our communities are really asking for a different direction or an alignment with our state government and our local governments that will ensure at least a fair opportunity for well-being for our communities. So we're going to start trying to get through in 1 hour as much as possible. We have a lot of information we'd like to impart, and I'm really excited and proud of my compañeros and compañeras and in this amazing work that we're all doing together, protecting Mother Earth and protecting our communities. We're going to start with Jill Mangaliman from Got Green to begin to really explain to us, you know, what we're talking about when we say we don't want an emission trading program. So, Jill?
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Linda. Hi, everyone. My name is Jill Mangaliman. I'm with Got Green. I'm the executive director and also a member of the Front and Center Community Council. And Got Green is also a founding member of Front and Centered. yeah, just waiting up for my slides. Oh, thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. Oh, that's not the beginning. Can you go to the top? That's, ooh, thank you. I guess I just want to start off in honor of, just recognizing those who have come before us, especially in the environmental justice movement, our indigenous communities who were the original stewards of the land. We are on Duwamish land on the Coast Salish Sea, and really want to honor that all the lessons and the struggle and their rights to land. I especially put this quote from Chief Selt about not, there's a lot to learn from our indigenous communities on how to take care of the land. And this quote really hit home to me. Is like, how can you buy or sell the sky, right? It's strange to us. And so how do we see the earth and the environment as sacred? This is our home. And also in honor of Black History Month, also want to recognize the roots of the environmental justice movement come from the civil rights movement, right? Like this was about rights of people and rights of land, especially people of color. And so in this picture, this is of communities in Alabama struggling against pollution in their own community. And so really want to make sure that folks know that we have a deep history and a legacy that we're carrying on today, that this isn't just something that just started up yesterday. We are continuing on that legacy right now. So I want to, next slide, please. Talk a little bit about myself. There's a lot of pictures here, it's a collage. Born and raised in Seattle, West Seattle to be exact. My family immigrated here from the Philippines to my parents, especially looking for a better life and to escape martial law. And I grew up with the New Coral Steel factory outside my window and the highway outside my window. And so that was a regular sight for me. I thought it was quite normal to see clouds of smoke outside. I didn't realize that pollution that we were breathing in from the highways, from the cars, and from the factory were actually, endangering our health. And just to let you know, like, yeah, I didn't have language about this until I joined Got Green in 2009 and became really, learned a lot about like the connections between health and environment and how is it not far away, but it's actually here in our own backyards, and really started to, connect the dots. And then further on, another thing that impacted me was doing typhoon relief in the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan, seeing the devastation of those typhoons and the flash floods that followed, and just knowing that it was years and years of extraction and logging and mining that also, caused the land to give way and the impacts it and destroyed lives and killed lives. So I think it's something that I carry with me today, and why climate change is so important for our communities, for my community in particular, because it impacts the people I love a lot and the people in my community. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so something to also note is that, we are aware that living next to polluting industries has an impact on our health. There on the King County Public website, there is, higher rates of asthma and respiratory issues and diseases correlating with your zip code, right? Where you live determines your life expectancy. On the left-hand side, this mapping tool that Front and Centered worked on with the University of Washington Department of Occupational Health actually really affirmed our experiences on the ground, showing that communities of color and working class communities, low-income communities are often cited next to polluting areas, polluting facilities. And so we really, we're grateful to have our stories and experiences affirmed by the map and the data. And then we also know under COVID that our communities are at higher risk. A Harvard study put out a study last year saying that those who are exposed long-term to pollution have a higher death rate. And so just knowing that Black and Brown communities, our people are, breathing in and out this pollution, and now we're faced with this pandemic, and our lives are at further risk. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so that's why we're very, very cautious and vigilant against false promises when we are tackling the climate issue. Climate change can't be solved by market mechanisms. That's something that I've learned from the environmental justice movement, that we really need to get at the root of the causes. And learning from other places. So I had the opportunity to go to Richmond, California, and hear their stories about their impacts on the cap and trade program there. And to this day, you know, they are seeing more and more pollution. And in fact, last year they were experiencing more flares and oil spills. So if this type of program is supposed to reduce pollution and emissions, then why is it worse, or why are people still experiencing terrible things? And then last but not least, like around offsets, right? These programs that are saying that they're reducing and in forests around the world. Why is it that the Amazon and the acres are burning down, right? After all that money was invested. So these are things that were promised through the cap and trade program, but aren't happening. And I wanted to share this quote from folks in California. I saw this around even legislators are regretting the cap and trade program, right? Because they promised that this would be a benefit to the community, and yet they see the pollution still happening in their community. They still see people struggling. And unfortunately, even though the program is failing in California, they had to renew the program because they became really reliant on that revenue. And so that's something to be cautious of. And I often talk about the trickle down environmentalism, but I actually got it from California Assembly member Cristina Garcia, who first said it. So yeah, next slide, please. In terms of cap and trade, what we're really cautious of as community members are the details, right? How does this actually benefit our communities? And after looking through the policies and what it is, we found that carbon trading and offsets don't actually reduce carbon emissions at the source. It's really about how does the company get out of reducing locally, but they can show reductions in their accounting or somewhere else. There was also in specifically SB 5126, there were free giveaways to the private utilities and even to frack gas companies. So why are we giving them free allowances or free giveaways when we're trying to get them to, you know, be responsible for their pollution? And then there's so much more focus on protecting bottom line and lowering costs. And expanding markets. That's a problem, because why is that the focus instead of actually tackling reductions or ensuring that these communities are being protected, or ensuring that these communities are being invested in? It shouldn't be about like lowering costs or making more money, but how are we actually addressing the climate issue? And in some cases, right, the companies don't even have to pay. They can pass it down the cost onto the workers and the communities instead. And then another red flag, that the idea of carbon markets actually comes itself, Exxon, BP, these companies have been promoting these policies ever since the Kyoto Protocol. So this is not, that is a major red flag. It's like, where do these come from? The people responsible for polluting our communities in the first place. And then I would just share that, you know, as community members, we have to look out. There's always, you know, language out there that may be mixed into climate policies. And so things that we have to be vigilant against, language we have to look out for is like trading, credits, offsets, allowances, linking markets, and business flexibility. Again, what does that have to do with, you know, addressing climate change?
We may have lost the sound from Jill. Is that right? There.
Looks like we lost the sound.
Okay. Jill, can we hear you? Can you try it one more time? We're not hearing you for some reason. see. Okay, well, Rosalinda, maybe we can take it back to you and we can keep moving in our program and circle back to any final points from Jill towards the end, if that works.
Yes, I'm really sorry this happened. This is the technical difficulties that we face, but I wanted to just touch on a couple of things that Jill said there. And next, we're gonna welcome Yolanda, but I wanted to say that some of the things that, can we hear you, Jill, now? We can't. Some of the things, I mean, when Jill was speaking, it really was striking to me. We speak about this often, that our communities that we represent and all of the partners in Front and Center Coalition are grounded together in unity with knowledge and the experience of a struggle that we've had for a long time. But we have knowledge of what is causing our suffering, our disparities. We know what it is. And Jill said, you know, she found the language that she needed to express. And I think that that's what our communities are doing. And I wanted to just mention, you know, her comments on the disparities with COVID, that's one of the biggest realities we're facing right now when we look at policy and legislation right now, is that we're dying. The disparities with this pandemic is made worse with a long history of exploitation and the damage to Mother Earth. And we're seeing it. It's very clear to us what has caused this, but it's also really clear to us what we need to do to make it better, not just for us, but for everybody around us, including Mother Earth. And that is really the value of this coalition, is that we all are coming together with the same vision and the same alignment about what our communities are asking needs to happen. We're united in this this vision. The question is that the policy that's going to come to help us move this vision forward is what's challenging, not just to us, but to the same corporations and to the politicians that are trying to implement policy. And I just want to say that we are working really hard in our unity to link the policy and regulatory impacts to what is happening to us, but link it in a positive way. We also are grounded in that, not just grounded in the struggle to survive, but we're grounded in the vision of solutions that we know we can bring if we can just explain to you, if people just would listen. So we're growing and we're developing our own self-governance and self-determination on how we're going to protect Mother Earth and therefore the future of our children. Yolanda Matthews is the co-leader of the Community Council. So we've developed our Community Council of Leadership with a participatory model of trying to get many of our organizations to participate more. And that's part of the work that we do, is this education to help our brothers and sisters like Jill and myself and Yolanda find our language to describe what we need to see happen and what has happened to us in relation to pollution and the damage that's done to our environment where we live, because we don't want to move from there. This is our land, and we want to continue the stewardship that Indigenous communities in Washington State have fixed or taken care of for so long. There would be no salmon right now if it wasn't for the Indigenous peoples, the Coast Salish peoples, fighting so hard, giving their lives to protect the salmon. We would be so much worse off. So I'd like to introduce Yolanda Matthews, mi compañera, my sister, as the co-lead in the Community Council, to take us to the next step. Yolanda?
Hey everyone, you can hear me okay? Yes? Okay, great. So yeah, my name is Yolanda Matthews. I am a climate justice organizer with Puget Sound SAGE, and also co-lead of the Community Council with Rosalinda. I use she, her pronouns. And yeah, I'm going to shortly introduce two speakers who are going to speak on issues of cap and trade and community analysis, and they're just giving you a little bit of background on what has been working for the community as far as coming up with some potential solutions to this cap and trade problem that we have. and also introducing some flaws within the cap and trade model. So the first speaker is Katie Valenzuela. Katie is a Sacramento City Council member, a national climate justice consultant, former climate justice policy director of California Environmental Justice Alliance. And Danny Cullenward is our second speaker. Danny is a Stanford lecturer, energy economist, lawyer, and policy director at Carbon Plan and the California Senate's appointee on the Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee. And so I'm just going to be asking them some questions as it relates to cap and trade and what has been working and what hasn't in California. So these questions are for both of you. First question is, what does the evidence say about whether cap and trade is delivering on its promise in California?
Katie, do you want to start, or would you like me to handle that?
I will start briefly and then defer to Danny. Thank you for having us today. I appreciate the grounding of this. It really helped me center. I grew up in Oildale in Kern County, which is the heart of 70% of California's ongoing oil extraction in the state of California. After serving as co-chair for our Environmental Justice Advisory Committee at the state, went to the legislature to try to fight the extension of cap and trade from the inside, and then left to work at CEJA. And I'm proud to continue doing that work, which is very ongoing. We just announced yesterday a fracking ban bill, actually SB 467, and are hoping to finally make progress on these issues. But what the evidence is showing us is what EJ Groups spoke to all along. What we know is that the facilities that are covered by cap and trade are disproportionately located in communities of color and BIPOC communities. What we also know is that since cap and trade has begun, not only have most facilities not reduced emissions, that in some cases we've seen increased emissions. And what we also know is that overwhelmingly the facilities that are increasing emissions are the ones that are located closest to communities of color. And we don't enjoy saying we told you so, because the price of we told you so is pretty severe. And I know we'll talk a lot more about the environmental justice ramifications and what we've been fighting for now going on 15 years in California. But that is what the evidence is showing us. There is no evidence that cap and trade is driving down emissions reductions in California. And I'll pitch it to Danny to get more into why that might be.
All righty, thanks, Katie, and thank you, Yolanda and Derek, for the chance to be here. I'll confess up front, I'm coming from a very different background, and I've learned a great deal from working with friends like Katie and others in the California EJ movement. To learn more about, frankly, would have been my blind spots. I'm somebody who's worked on climate policy as a researcher and a practitioner, including as somebody who thinks markets do have a role to play in overall climate solutions, but I'm going to look straight at them when I see them and try and be honest about what I see. And I think Katie's raised some just critically important points. There isn't significant evidence that California's cap and trade program has been driving emissions down. It largely rests on top of a set of much more ambitious and aggressive and successful regulations in the state of California. So when we do see progress on climate pollution, it's much more directly attributable to things like our clean electricity standards or our standards for setting regulations for cars and trucks to get cleaner over time. These are the things that are driving a lot of the action in California, and cap and trade largely sits on top of those efforts without doing a great deal. And let me recognize, I think we may get into this in conversation. When you look at the cap and trade program, it's dominated by the use of carbon offsets. And I think this is just a fascinating thing to say, because the environmental justice community was right early and often about the role of carbon offsets and sort of deferring and defraying the reductions that people are looking for from these kinds of systems. And I think the rest of the climate communities had enormous blind spots about the politics around offsets and how they end up stuck in these low quality outcomes. They also dominate a lot of these programs. The programs that succeed, and I'll just briefly mention, the European Union has a carbon market that has many of the features that, that we heard criticized earlier in this presentation, and they've managed to make it work with very different politics to a much different and stronger outcome, in no small part because they got rid of offsets. And because they managed the system transparently to address the kinds of community concerns I've heard articulated. That's not been the experience for the most part in the United States. And I worry that the California example, where things have gotten opaque and complex and basic facts are contested in extraordinarily complex regulatory processes where industry lobbyists dominate the conversation. That's the problem that we face with these systems. There's a structural imbalance between the complexity of the program, the investments that the incumbent polluters make to be present in every conversation, and the inability of community and environmental groups to have a clear and articulate voice in that process. Not because they don't try, but because when they criticize things like carbon offsets, they're disinvited from the conversation.
Thank you both. So my next question, I feel like, especially you, Katie, you kind of touched on it a bit in your answer. What has been California's EJ community's experience in cap and trade? Is there anything more that you want to add to what you've already said? And then also, would you like to weigh in on that, Danny?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit more there. So I'll tell this a little bit chronologically and we can dig in, right? But when we passed our climate policy in 2006, setting our emissions target in statute, there was nothing in there about cap and trade. We did permit the use of market mechanisms, but the vision there was that we were going to achieve better public health and prevent climate catastrophe by looking at transforming our economy away from fossil fuels. That was the vision, right? Is that we were going to get at the root of this and we could reduce carbon while improving public health by reducing co-pollutants and really providing better economic opportunity. So then starts the scoping plan process, and the scoping plan is what California creates every 5 years as our roadmap for how we're going to get to the target. So the first scoping plan is where cap and trade came in as a regulatory proposal from the California Air Resources Board. And at that time, the concerns that were articulated from EJ groups were very obvious to us. If you're not requiring direct emissions reductions, how do you know that you're not going to perpetuate inequity? Allowing people to purchase credits, allowing people to purchase offsets is essentially letting them pay to continue to pollute. And no matter how much we reinvest those, we are still operating at a deficit. We have the authority to just require the reductions. And through that, the investment in the mitigation measures and the new technology that would come in to take the space of formerly polluting industries. That was always the critique. And we lost that critique. There were lawsuits filed, not just by Cal Chamber, which is the one that most people know, is it a tax, is it a fee? But the environmental justice groups attempted as well to stop it because our argument was that the cap and trade program as designed didn't meet the mandate of AB 32. Fast forward to when that lawsuit failed, and the compromise that ARB gave to us was adaptive management. And they said, we are going to monitor these facilities, and if there's any increase in emissions, if there's any increase in co-pollutants, we will know and we can make adjustments. So that was their thing. We don't believe this will happen, but to pacify you EJ folks, we're going to create a map where we can track pollution and tell you if there's changes that are being made. So fast forward 5 years after that conversation, adaptive management still hasn't been stood up. We finally start to get pollution mapping because we passed laws requiring it, in addition to laws requiring more environmental justice representation on the Air Resources Board and legislative representation. And suddenly these maps come out and they tell exactly the story that we had worried about. We could hone in, you could draw shapes over geographic regions. So I went to Kern County, where I'm from, where my family still lives, and I drew a shape and I clicked in the box, and what I saw was that emissions were increasing. So I turned this map to ARB and said, okay, you told us that you were going to do something. What are you going to do about this? Oh, we'll look into it. We're not sure what's going on. We'll look into it. We'll look into it. And 2 years passed in that time while my nephews were born, while their lungs were forming, while they were continuing to breathe polluting air. And there was no answer to that question. So we were fighting at that time the extension of cap and trade, and we had overwhelming evidence that it was not only not achieving the carbon goals, but that it was hurting public health, and that communities like ours had already waited at that point years for the results that we had been promised, and we wanted change. And we successfully delayed the extension of our climate targets for that. There's a lot of stories about why the 2030 target bill didn't pass the first year. The big story is that the environmental justice groups working with the Latino caucus and other allies successfully delayed because we wanted answers for what California Air Resources Board was going to do differently. And we almost attempted, we pitched a couple bills that were going to try to ramp up the price of carbon. There were bills that were going to try to eliminate the use of offsets, all of these things that still weren't great. We don't like market mechanisms as an ideological perspective, which Jill did a great job of laying out why. But we thought maybe we could at least tighten the market enough that it would become more of what they thought it was going to be and what they were telling us it was going to do. And that's when we got pitched something that has forever harmed our movement and that we are still recovering for. And what they pitched us was a community air protection program called AB 617. And they said, okay, we understand that the carbon program isn't meeting your needs, so we're going to build you this program to address air pollution. We're going to target communities that are overburdened. We're going to invest. We're going to make the air districts do these processes and tell us what they're going to do to reduce emissions in those areas. And by doing so, they bifurcated the carbon process from the air pollution process. And what that did was it gave a blank check to keep going to the carbon program. You no longer have to worry about public health because we're going to address it over here. While we are now 3 years into implementation of that bill, again, another 3 years where I've had a couple more nephews born, where I've had more family members get sick, I've had more family members die. And we still have not seen emissions reductions in those communities. And so now we're going on year 15 of the California climate program, and we still have no reductions in our communities, and we still have no evidence that the programs they're putting forward are fulfilling the promises that were made. And so we keep doing this exercise where we keep getting told, hey, go over here, we'll do it like this, we'll do it like that. But the basic foundational premise is broken. It's broken. It's been broken in California. Our renewable energy programs, the car and truck standards, the things that Danny talked about that are direct standards that require you to meet something in there. You can't buy your way out of it necessarily. There's a little wiggle room here and there, but for the most part, you had to meet this standard. That is what's driving California's climate policy. And now we're looking at a 2030 target and a 2045 target that we are not on track to meet, that we know we don't have enough to do. And so now guess what the new fight is? Carbon sequestration. Now suddenly everybody says, well, gosh, we've done everything we can to reduce emissions and this is just as far as we can go. So maybe we need to allow refineries and natural gas power plants to capture their carbon and pump it underground. And that'll really help communities. I mean, forget the fact that we don't know what this does in a state like California long-term. Forget the fact that we don't know if we can guarantee this for 100 years. Forget the fact that we know we have the technology to do this better. This bifurcation of carbon from public health has been catastrophic for our movement. And so this is the year that we're finally saying enough is enough. We're throwing the line in the sand. This is the campaign that we're doing to say, you've got to tackle fossil fuels. You've got to have a standard. You've got to do this differently. And it's unfortunate that it's taken us 15 years because I think a lot about the people who've died. I think a lot about the kids with asthma like me, who we knew 15 years ago that this wasn't going to help them. And I just think a lot about the lies. I think a lot about the rebranding we've done. We say we've met the cap, but what it means to mean the cap is pretty much pointless when you have this many allowances in the system. It's pretty much pointless when you can charge $12 a ton, which is nothing, and get out of reducing emissions at your source. It means nothing when the oil industry and Cal Chamber hold this up as their model of what they want to see happen in every state. And I could keep ranting, but I'm going to stop now and let Danny chime in if he has anything to add.
And the only thing to add, I'm not, again, a representative of an EJ group, but I've watched these debates as well. And I think the most important thing for people to take away from them is that the fiction of these programs is presenting a hard limit on emissions is weaponized against marginalized political communities time and time again. And I think that is an almost universal problem with these programs. You never quite get a guarantee on a cap, even in the best of circumstances. And when the politics are rotten, as they are when you have a multi-sector program like California's, like prospective programs in other states, it's very difficult, almost impossible politically to really make a serious cap work because it's very easy to introduce new allowances or look the other way on offsets. And this sort of game of sticking my fingers in all the different holes in the dike as the water levels keep rising. I do it all the time to try and do what I can in these systems, but it's a losing game everywhere it's been tried. And the fiction that a cap is a hard cap on emissions is the fiction I see most destructively employed to frustrate the agendas of people who are thinking about local community health, who have those concerns. And I really do worry about that because when we talk about cap and trade, there's this assertion that there will be a cap on emissions. If that were true, and we could do that, I would have a lot of things to dispute Katie's experience about, but the fact is it's not, and it never has been in any of these programs. And that's the big lie. You can create effective markets, I promise you, when you have the right politics and the right design, but it's extraordinarily difficult to do if you don't attack that stuff head on. And none of the systems in North America have really taken that seriously. And I don't see any indication of anything when I look at the Washington proposal. I see a heavier use of carbon offsets. I see a doubling down on the strategies that have undermined the progress that we could have had on these programs if we had tried differently in California. So it's a different perspective maybe than Katie's, but I share her frustration at how the sort of game of moving the ball has frustrated an honest conversation on a set of issues that ultimately is about who lives and who dies. And we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yeah, thank you both. Yeah, Katie, I feel like you said it all with that question and answering that question. And Danny, I very much appreciate the use of the word fiction repeatedly. Because yeah, when it comes to, using, trying to sell cap and trade as a solution, like it's definitely fiction. So our next question is, what are your biggest concerns with cap and trade being rebranded as cap and invest as it's proposed in Washington State?
That's a great, it's another one of those catchy rebrandings that Jill alluded to in the opening, right? And it really comes down to me to like a super simple question. How much money can I pay you to make it okay that your family might die sooner than they need to? That's the question. And they have leveraged that greenhouse gas reduction fund in California to say, oh, but we're investing in your community. Look at this affordable housing complex we built, and look at this, new bikeway that you got. And aren't you excited? When your kid can't go out and exercise because they're suffering from severe asthma, as I used to in Oildale, I used to get blackouts. I used to think they actually thought that my eyes were going bad because I started getting tunnel vision when I ran. And they said, oh, maybe your cornea is detached or something. Only to find out that the reason I was doing that is because I was starting to black out because I couldn't breathe while I was running outdoor in my own community, at my own school as a high school student. So there is no price that can be paid to compensate for the damage that continued pollution will do, especially now. And I have to couch this in terms of like, this is not the conversation it was 15 years ago. 15 years ago, I think we tricked ourselves into thinking we had some more time to figure this out. It's 2021. We don't have time to keep figuring this out. We have got to do direct measures on these facilities. And we know that what will happen when you do a direct measure is that new, cleaner technologies and economies will come in their place. So is the government going to necessarily have as much money to reinvest? No. But can we try to regulate and plan an economic transition that's going to benefit workers and benefit communities? Yeah, we can do that. We know how to do that. And so I just think we don't have time to keep saying, it's okay, we're going to plant some trees in your community. So I hope the continued refining activity next door to you is okay, because it's not okay anymore. It's not okay for that community, and it's not okay for any of us who want to prevent catastrophic climate change from coming into our world.
I think there's maybe an important difference in the way that we look at this that may be relevant for folks here, which is just that there's a huge difference between here is a modest price on carbon that comes from an oversupplied market with a lot of offsets that doesn't control pollution in your communities. And that's the end, versus this is a small part of something bigger, and it's not designed to detract from the primary agenda, which is focusing on those direct emission reductions. And the biggest problem I see is that the language and the rhetoric and the politics around caps lead to that inevitable conflict. And that means the things that work get deprioritized and the needs of communities get underemphasized in real political discussions. I'm somebody who thinks if you could put those together, that's better. But I see the cap get weaponized. And I don't see, to be perfectly honest, much of a difference between cap and invest or cap and trade, or frankly, carbon tax where you spend the money in different ways. I think done well, that can be an important, but a small piece of the puzzle. If it's sold as the final solution, it's going to do exactly what Katie said. And that is where I join her completely in my concerns around that approach.
So is there anything else that either of you would like to add? We're hoping that you can stay around for a Q&A. But yeah, anything, I'm for the most part finished with my questions right now. So yeah, just anything that you may want to add to the conversation.
I think the conversation we're getting ready to have in California, with or without the Air Resources Board help, honestly, we're going to do it anyways, is, we're looking at what carbon neutrality looks like. And carbon neutrality is a really dangerous phrase, but we're basically ready to construct the vision of what the end goal looks like in California. What does it look like to eliminate combustion? What does it look like to eliminate, natural gas power, and to really build a vision back from that of then the steps that we need to take. And that's part of, for me, the biggest challenge that we've had in California is EJ groups, we've largely been focused on what that vision is, what we want our communities to look like, where we're trying to go. Industry and our regulators, unfortunately, have been very focused on where we are and how do we, kind of tinker around the edges and make what happens now in California a little bit cleaner. And without that big vision of what your state's going to look like, where you're going toward, you end up investing in things that are false solutions. You end up tinkering around the edges and really propping up industries that frankly may not be a part of that vision in the future, and planning for that up front and really being strategic about how you align your regulations and your laws to facilitate that community vision. That's the way this should have gone. That was what the EJAC, we've been asking for every round of the scoping plan. What's the vision? We have a vision and we're trying to make this plan to go to that vision. They're saying, oh yeah, we want to clean things up and meet this target, but they're still imagining refining expanding in California. We take 40% of the crude extracted from the Amazon forest, actually correction, 60% of the crude, new numbers are coming out, from the Amazon forest come to California refineries. That's not in my vision for 2045. And so I think there's something to be said for how you reframe and resist the sort of siloing off that cap and trade proponents do, and really focus on that vision, because that vision doesn't allow for something like cap and trade. The vision doesn't allow for tinkering around the edges, and really puts a nice sort of barometer upon which you can judge these proposals and their ability to make that transformation a reality.
I'll add, this is a shameless plug, but if folks are interested in a deep dive, I wrote a book on this called Making Climate Policy Work that looks at this experience with these programs around the world. There's I think a free version you can still access at David Roberts' newsletter Volts that covers some of these basics. The stuff is really important to understand. This game gets played the same basically everywhere it gets tried. And I think it's time for us to start picking up on the lessons of history. Offsets are the beginning of the problem, and you're looking at a much heavier use of offsets than we have right now in California, and offsets have largely dominated our system. So I'm with Katie 100%. If we don't start talking about the direct emission reductions, we lose sight of the end goal. If you start with a cap and trade program that's designed around offsets as the primary means of compliance, you're not on the wrong foot, you're walking in the wrong direction. And that's, I think, really cannot be overstated. And if that continues to be a sticking point in negotiations, I think you're looking at a system that's designed to replicate the outcomes we have, which are a barrier to the kinds of long-term visions we need to develop. So I really appreciate the chance to speak with you all today and look forward to speaking more in Q&A.
Thank you so much, Katie and Danny. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge, and yeah, I'll pass it on to Rosalinda.
Thank you. Thank you all very much, Yolanda, Katie, and Danny. I'd like to move forward with our next sister in the Community Council. Really proud to have known Susan. We go back a long ways, and I just want to say that as a farm worker in rural Washington State, especially on the coast here in LaConner, Skagit County, that I'm getting choked up a little bit here, but I can honestly say that my survival as a Latina, as a Mexican-American farm worker in the fields of Skagit County, that my culture and my spirit literally were saved by my relations with Swinomish and with the Native American people, the Coast Salish people of Washington State, that they did provide, if not the same type of language, but another type of language of home, of the land, of the environment, of the salmon, and the clean water and the air. And I think that the knowledge that the stewardship of the good environment that we have now was because of very, very strong spirited fights from the Coast Salish people in protecting the salmon. And I recognize that we are on land that they saved, and that we have the honor and the privilege of that land. But then also that they recognize with me the damage that's being done in the agricultural industry with the pesticide runoff and the toxins that are being used in food production. So it's we go back a long way. I also want to mention that our discussions, many of the leadership of Front and Center's discussions around the just transition and climate justice began in 2014. So in listening to our California brother and sister, you know, time is of the essence. Since we've been in these discussions since 2014, formed this organization, have tried the initiative, have been involved with policy and trying to impart our vision, because that is exactly what we have. We have a vision that has been held up by Indigenous people in Washington State about what the future should be like, right? That's grounded in traditions that are thousands and thousands of years old. So it's my honor to have you listen to my sister, Susan Balbas, to talk about just exactly what is a just transition. We say it a lot, and people, I mean, really, I think we irritate people because we keep bringing it up. But that is part of our vision in Washington State. Susan, thank you for sharing this stage with us.
Thank you, Rosalinda. And thank you, Katie and Danny, so much for spending time with us today and sharing your experience in California over the last 15 years. And I say to us here, how do we not make this our story? We don't want this to be our story. We don't want to be here 15 years from now telling that same story. Let's move in a different direction. Let's listen to our neighbors from California. I have a lot of my family there as well, Katie, and I hear you. It's tragic and it's very difficult. So we want to talk a little bit today about, we're often asked, like, what do we want? We want a just transition. And what do we mean by that, right? Sometimes we joke in Indigenous communities, it's a return to 1491. Isn't it exactly true? Because of course, the environment is a lot different than it was in 1491. And we don't have the we didn't have the technologies that we have now. So it's really bringing in our values and focusing in on our values about working in partnership with Mother Earth and our natural systems, instead of dominating over them and extracting from Mother Earth, but really working in partnership as a part of life. And so just transition is a principle, it's a process, and it's a practice, right? That builds economic and political power that can shift us from this extractive economy, which has been so destructive, to a regenerative economy. And it's the only way that we can get to a safe climate, right? So what strategies will we need to get there? We know the biggest sectors of pollution, transportation, energy, buildings, and the global industrial food system. Those are the biggest polluters, right? But that doesn't tell us how we actually make the transition, let alone how we make it just. So making it just is by really leading with our values and leading with justice for our frontline communities. And that's what we stand for at Front and Centered. We believe we can make a just transition through stopping the bad, building the new, and divesting from the fossil fuel economy and investing in community. It's really about resourcing our positive solutions. So to get there, Front and Center works to ensure that we, number one, center those disproportionately impacted in governments. Those most impacted will not compromise on our false promises, which we have shown time and time again, but will demand the solutions that show up in real ways where we live and work, and we must be at the table. Number two, restore community connections to place. We need to be stewards of our lands. We need to consult with our tribes who have treaty rights over their reservation lands and their ceded territories of their original lands, where they have treaty rights to practice in their usual and accustomed places, right? Fight displacement and plant and root locally. Next, we want to create livelihoods within a healthy environment. So we want to create green jobs and livelihoods that work for rather than against Mother Earth, uphold and strengthen our cultural practices. Because it's been shown time and time again where Indigenous people are practicing and tending the wild, Mother Earth thrives, our relatives thrive. And we want to transition to renewable resources and energy, stop the fossil fuels, find our paths of using our renewable energies, build natural buildings, and build community scale energy sources, right? So that's what I got today. So I want to thank you. Now we're going to make sure that you know what is happening this legislative session that will move us forward on a just transition. And we'd like to welcome Rich Stoltz from One America to speak to our policy ideas, and Guillermo to speak to what's happening this legislative session. Thank you. Rich?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Mhm.
Great. Well, thank you, Susan. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of my colleagues from Front and Center and the Community Council. So it's important to think a little bit about what the framework is, but also how we turn that into action. And I just first want to acknowledge that this is difficult work and there are no silver bullets. And sometimes the simplest conceptual solutions are the most difficult to put into place, given politics and a whole range of dynamics that we're all grappling with. It'd be helpful to provide some examples of what we're fighting for now and what we've actually accomplished, often in partnership with a wide range of partners in the broader environmental community, within organized labor, and within the business community. So there are approaches to taking action that can actually lead to significant change, that don't get us caught up in unproductive arguments over, what kind of, over, cap and trade strategies or other strategies that remain controversial because organizations like Front and Center have pointed out what folks have learned in other places. An example of one thing that we can all point to as Front and Centered and in partnership with a broad range of allies has been significant change that we won collectively on electricity and 100% clean electricity legislation that Washington State enacted a couple legislative sessions ago. It mandated electric utilities get off fossil fuels and required equitable distribution of benefits like home weatherization and created incentives for good jobs. We also fought to include and will continue to fight to include energy assistance to low-income households that actually meet the needs of community members and residents. But there's so much more that we need to be thinking about in addition to electricity. We need action that will reduce carbon emissions and all sources of pollution. Our recent report, Accelerating a Just Transition in Washington State, Climate Justice Strategies from the Front Lines, summarizes 150 different policy strategies for climate justice. And those provide strong examples of what we can do collectively to steward the environment and ensure a future for our planet and our communities. For example, one of the largest emitters of carbon emissions in Washington State is transportation. There is much to be done to change land use planning, improve community stewardship, ensure that all communities can have access to jobs, schools, and food with public transportation. And there are things we can be doing through Front and Centered and through other tables to ensure that there are investments in transportation that build according to criteria that protects land, that protects transportation alternatives and choices, that strengthens public transportation that makes our transportation system cleaner and that discourages commuting. Furthermore, there are things we can be doing with regard to industrial emissions, like limiting emissions from major point sources of pollution with direct regulation, and ensuring that the health of workers, as well as the jobs of workers, are protected, and or that those workers are kept whole. And there's much that we can do with regard to the built environment, ensuring that everyone has warm, weatherized places to live that conserve energy, that do not rely on fossil fuels, and that are utilizing low carbon intensive materials. So those are a range of things that we can be working on collectively that could really advance the cause of a just transition and a vision for a world not dependent on fossil fuels. This will take substantial investments and create opportunities for good green jobs. So we also need progressive revenue sources and financial tools and proposals like SB 5373, the Washington Strong Green Bonds Bill, and ideas like the state bank are examples of what our state can do to help finance the kinds of investments we need in our future. And revenue gathered from taxes on pollution can be part of that mix as a transitional source of revenue, not something that we would want to ever have to rely upon. We can get out of and get most of this transition by targeting the air pollution that accompanies greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels. It's important to note that the debate around carbon emissions and its impact on communities often overshadow the fight over ensuring that we're not polluting ourselves to death, particularly in disadvantaged communities, but for everyone. Fossil fuel particulate matter is responsible for roughly 350,000 deaths per year of people older than 14. And Black people and people of color are disproportionately impacted by that particulate matter. By paying attention to these co-pollutants, we can clean up our air and contribute to the global problem of climate change. And in order to do that, we need to begin to focus on what we can do in our own backyards, as well as the models we can build here in Washington State that can help shape what might be possible elsewhere. It will take a real focus, finally, on ensuring that we have a foundation of justice for workers, for communities, for our families, that addresses and does not replicate historic disparities. And with regard to that, I wanted to pass on the call to our colleague Guillermo, who is on staff with Front and Centered, who can describe more about what we're attempting to accomplish with the HEAL Act. Yeah. Guillermo?
Thank you, Rich. Hi, everyone. As Rich mentioned, my name is Guillermo Rogel, the legislative advocate with Front and Centered. So I'm going to list off some of the bills that we're tracking this legislative session. If you are interested in learning more, Aurora also linked the legislative agenda there, and it's on our homepage, along with some resources that you can tap into if you have more questions. So to start off, the first one is going to be Senate Bill 5141. That's the HEAL Act. So that is embedding environmental justice into state planning, but also on top of that, making sure that community is proactively engaged in the planning process when state agencies are developing new programs, when they're enforcing existing ones. So we just want to make sure that that is a crucial component of environmental justice for Washington State. We had a really good hearing yesterday. About 560 people turned out to sign in pro, and we had really good testimony. So you can just expect that bill to be voted out of the Ways and Means Committee tomorrow. And then after that, we hope it's going to go to a Senate floor vote pretty soon. So after the HEAL Act, it's going to be the Green Revenue Bonds Bill. That is Senator Lovelet's bill 5373. So this is what's going to allow us to bond, and also invest in our communities pretty quickly. So again, that bill is 5373. In terms of the transportation package, we're tracking quite a few proposals. We like kind of what we're seeing, but we want to make sure that environmental justice is embedded more into whatever budget comes out of the transportation committees. So that is being led by Representative Fai in the House and Senator Saldana in the Senate. So we definitely want to move, I think, closer to Representative Fai's proposal, but still offer up some amendments to that package. The last one I think I'll mention is the Growth Management Act and amendments we're doing to that one. That is House Bill 1099 by Representative Dewar. So this is requiring environmental justice and local planning and reducing pollution, vehicle miles traveled, just trying to make sure that communities have more walkable destinations in their communities, climate resilience, and anti-displacement. So those are just some of the bills, not all of the bills that we are tracking, but just wanted to bring your attention to a few of those. So I think with that, I'm turning it over to, I don't know who I'm turning it over to. Is it Rosalinda?
We'll take it from here, Guillermo. Thanks so much. We've actually got, we're going over, and so we're going to start fielding questions if that is okay with the panelists. But first wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming, for everyone for hanging out the extra time. We've got a question for our guest speakers. One in particular is if offsets are limited to under 10% and tied to only in-state actions, does that help? That one is addressed to Danny.
Thank you for unmuting me. This is where life gets mad. Offsets limits are described as percentages like 8 or 4 or 10%. And those numbers sound really small, but it's actually, you need to compare that number against the pollution reductions in the program. And those actually reductions aren't often much bigger. So a 10% limit is actually huge. California right now has a 4% limit in the current market activities in 2021. We used to have an 8% limit. And the bill text that I saw when I looked at the proposal in Washington a week or two ago had a limit that went all the way up to 11% when you include all the carve-outs for what's out there. So it's actually an extraordinary volume of offsets that would come in at that level. And that would end up deferring action on sort of total reductions, probably for many years. And now this is all TBD based on these intricate details that are all deferred to an implementation process where the incumbent lobbyists run around and write all the rules. So I can't answer the question with finality, but 10% is huge. It's just massive. In-state versus out-of-state offsets, people have been talking a lot about this, but I think the problem with offsets is that the quality of offsets is almost universally really low. And most of the offsets programs that are out there don't represent real reductions. So the problem is not that you have claimed emission reductions in state or out of state. The problem is that a lot of those reductions aren't real in the first place. So when you have a lot of them, that's a big problem. And I would say that 10% or 11% or even 8% is really, really high. Frankly, even 4% is really high. If you look carefully at the quality of these programs, I wonder if we shouldn't have something closer to 0.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Danny. We've got another question for any of the panelists, but particularly for the community council members of Front and Centered. And that is, how do we actually counter the current the current proposal for the cap and trade bill? Jill, I'm going to unmute you.
Hello, thank you. Yeah, this is not the first time cap and trade has appeared in Washington or everywhere, but Governor Gregoire, Governor Inslee have raised cap and trade several times over the years, and constantly it has met opposition, from various groups, not just environmental justice groups like us, but also, individuals, community people, folks who actually want real reductions. And so I think the best way to counter it is just stop proposing it, stop bringing it up as it's a mere distraction from what we actually need to do. And so we've been doing a lot of workshops and articles and educational, discussions. And once people dig into the details, they're like, this is not a solution to climate. Like, this is not a solution to our problems. And so why are we spending time and energy on it? That's the best thing to do, is just stop proposing it and letting our senators and our representatives just to stop. And that would, then we can focus on real policies and real solutions. If anyone else wants to share.
Anybody else on the panel, go ahead and raise your hand. We've got like 16, 17 questions that we're not going to get to because people will want to take a break and have something to eat probably. But we do have a few more minutes, and I'm going to actually ask this more general question about how are you creating and cultivating this broader vision for a just transition? And maybe, let's see here. Rosalinda and Susan, first I will actually have Rosalinda. You're unmuted.
Are you going
I just
to
want
first,
to,
Rosalinda?
yeah, I just want to say we are building our coalition and growing our coalition front and center, educating from the bottom up, bringing along our community who is already actually there with us, with the vision of a just transition. It's just that articulation and, you know, building the confidence for them to go into a governance space that's going to listen. So this is what we're doing. This is it. You're watching us, and we're the leadership of community that's building the just transition vision. But more than that, we're trying to build the mechanisms to actually make it happen. And thank you for listening, because we're ready. I think that what's needed is a political will of the elected leadership. And I think we're going to have to start electing our own leadership, because we're not being listened to here and we're losing time.
I'd just like to say really quickly is what we do at Na'a Fund in partnership with Front and Centered is we are really building the capacity of Indigenous community leaders to lead this work. We're helping them with education, with resources to plan their innovative projects in Indigenous communities that work, that are real solutions. That I know we don't have a lot of time, but it's a lot of climate justice strategies that we are implementing on the ground, and also educating them and helping them to be at these policy tables. Like Rosalinda is, we'll elect our own officials that understand from direct experience, you know, what communities need.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Derek actually wanted to jump in with a last question as well.
This one could be for Katie or for others, but someone was saying, I've noticed that the supporters of the cap and trade bill in Washington are saying it's going to address all the equity issues. And I'm curious how you kind of counter this narrative that this is an environmental justice bill. And so the part for Katie is just about if that's happened in California, and then for the council about what to do about that here.
Yeah, there's no evidence that cap and trade will do that or is capable of that. I think there's two questions. I mean, is it capable of delivering reductions? Maybe. Is it going to address the equity concerns? No. And I think that's just inherent in the fact that when you set even a sector cap or something of that nature, you can't direct specific reductions in specific places, and you can't prevent the trading that happens that would favor larger facilities that are overwhelmingly located in communities of color. They're leaning on one specific study working paper out of University UC Santa Barbara that says, hey, look, there's no challenges. And I'm sure you've seen, hopefully, the paper quick retort that Danny and I put together, because we were getting asked this question a lot. I mean, the methodological, I'm not a statistician, I'm not an economist, and I could spot the methodological issues in this study. I mean, it was pretty egregious. What they were doing was really a gross mischaracterization, and it doesn't really capture what the core of the environmental justice critique was, which is this is going to reduce emissions in our community. Is this going to help correct the disproportionate burden that we face? And the answer to both of those questions is no matter how you design a cap and trade system. And that's just simple facts. But we can also send that out, or Derek, I think you have it as well if folks want to read that in a little bit more detail.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you to all of our panelists and from those who are virtually traveling all the way from California. Thank you everyone for hanging in there and engaging in this conversation today. We do have it recorded and we will make this recording available, and also wanted to let everyone know that to stay up to date on what Front and Centered is doing on climate justice as well as other environmental justice work, check out our website. Next week we will actually be launching our series on our view from the front line, starting with a two-part panel discussion on February 25th. What are the gaps between policy and practice during this pandemic? So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.